Welcome to Golf Smarter Mulligans, your second chance to gain insight and advice from the best instructors featured on the Golf Smarter podcast. Great golf instruction never gets old. Our interview library features hundreds of hours of game improvement conversations like this that are no longer available in any podcast app.
My favorite quote from the book is something that came from Davis Love III's father. Davis Love Jr. himself, of course, was a great golf instructor who learned from Harvey Penick. This is when Davis Jr. was playing at the University of Texas, and Harvey was the coach. And Harvey walked by the tee one day, and he saw Davis hitting to a practice green, which is about 150 yards away. And Harvey said, "Davis, get me some 5-irons on that green up there." And Davis turned around and looked at him and said, "Coach, that green's 150 yards away. I can hit 7-iron." And Harvey just looked at him and said, "Davis, get me some 5-irons on that green up there." And he walked away. And the point was, slow it down. You don't always have to do everything you do in a maximum way. Sometimes the answer is to try less hard. Sometimes the answer is to swing not so hard. Believe me, if that doesn't apply for life as well as in the game of golf, then I don't know what does.
With another interview from the archives of Golf Smarter, here's your host, Fred Green.
Whether you're listening to this episode before or after the 2009 U.S. Open, hopefully you'll notice the stories from the broadcast that are told from outside the ropes. Jimmy Roberts is the reporter who gets those great stories. He'll enlighten us with history, give us perspective, and get the inside story. When a player steps off the 18th green, he'll be waiting, but not to ask the obvious question. Jimmy Roberts is thoughtful, compassionate, interested, smart, and not afraid to ask the probing question. Jimmy's new book is called Breaking the Slump: How Great Players Survive Their Darkest Moments in Golf and What You Can Learn from Them. It's quite a coup for this quiet little podcast to get someone like Jimmy Roberts on the show, and here's what's crazier. When I booked this recording, Jimmy suggested that we do it on a specific day that was in the middle of his promotional media blitz. That morning when I got Jimmy on the phone, I asked him how the other sessions were going. He said, "Oh, I canceled all the others because I had back surgery 2 days ago and just got out of the hospital this morning." Pressure on Fred. Anyway, you get a sense of how tired he was from his first answer. But after that, he's lucid, and I thought very interesting. Welcome to the Golf Smarter podcast, Jimmy.
Thanks, Fred. It's good to be with you.
Thank you so much. It's really, truly an honor for me to have you on because you are one of my interviewing heroes. I have to tell you right off the top.
Well, you're kind to say that. I'm sure there's some of the people who I interview I'm not such a hero to occasionally.
Well, but the reason I say that is because you are not the guy who's out there shoving a microphone in someone's face after a round saying, "Well, what did you think of that shot?" or "How did you feel about that?" You're looking for, or you and I look for people and say, everybody has a story.
Well, I do truly believe that everybody has a story. That was, I'm sure we'll get to this in a minute, but that's how the book kind of came about. I'm writing a book about slumps, and I go and I talk to Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer, and people say, "Well, they never had slumps," and I'm thinking, everybody's had slumps, and everybody's got a story. I have become fond of saying that slumps are just a matter of degree. That a slump for Jack Nicklaus is losing the ball to the left. A slump for Jimmy Roberts is losing the ball. So it's just a matter of degree, and everybody does have a story. Doesn't matter who you are. I truly believe that, and I think that's one of the reasons why I have a job.
Yeah, exactly, and you do so well at it. It's interesting that you say about it's a matter of degree because in reading the book, I was waiting to see a slump. What I kept feeling like I was watching is these are guys who just had a hiatus from winning.
Yeah, well, I think there's, look, again, there are some people for whom that was the issue, and there are some people for whom, it was a cataclysmic, event in their golfing lives. Scott Verplank, I mentioned him. He's a guy who went 2 years. I believe the numbers are 39 events over a 2-year period, and he made it to the weekend twice. And there were a lot of reasons for that. Jack Nicklaus, he's the opposite of that. Jack Nicklaus, in 1979 had reached a point where for the first time in his life, he hadn't won at least 2 events in a year. He'd actually gone a year without winning any events. And so for him, that was an enormous slump. I mean, he dropped out of the top 10 for the first time in his life. You know, he was able to come back and win 2 majors in 1980. So, I mean, that was, you know, conquering a slump for him. It's all relative. But, you know, and everybody's got different stories. I mean, Paul Azinger had to come back from cancer and the death of his good friend Payne Stewart, the trauma of losing good friends in a plane crash like that. You know, Ben Crenshaw got divorced and had thyroid problems. He had to conquer that.
Justin Rose?
Yeah, Justin Rose, I mean, had to come back from the inflated expectations that everybody else had for him. You know, everybody's got a story. I mean, they really, really do. And, I mean, when I was growing up, I was a big fan of programs like Wide World of Sports, and then I was fortunate enough to go and work for them for 8 years. That's how I got my start in television. But I was weaned on. That was sports for me. I mean, I think today's younger generation are weaned on SportsCenter.
Right.
And it was interesting because in my life I've actually worked for both of them, but they're vastly different animals. I mean, growing up I watched Jim McKay and Jack Whitaker and people like that, and they told stories about people. And so
spanning the globe.
That was the diet that I ate.
Yeah.
But then, you know, I don't think that's the kind of thing. I don't think that's the way sports is consumed today. I think it's consumed more in terms of statistics and results and comparisons. And, you know, while I like that in many ways, I mean, I just think my DNA is different. I'm really much more interested in stories. And my wife is funny. She says, you know, we'll go out with people and I'll start to talking to people. And she said, she turned to me once and she said, you know, you don't ever have a conversation with people. You interview them. So I guess that's just, I'm curious is all I can say.
Well, it's interesting because my wife, I think, is the interviewer in our family. She was a radio talk show host for a long time. And my sons and I have not made fun of her, but have always said, you know, it's amazing because when she says to somebody, how are you, they really spill their guts, right. You know, and it's not how are you, it's how are you, you know,
right.
And they just spill their guts to her. It's absolutely amazing.
Well, you know, I think it's a real talent, anybody who can elicit from other people that which is beyond the superficial. You know, I mean, that's what I would love to be able to do. And sometimes I'm able to get to it, and sometimes I'm not. In the book, I wrote about talking to Phil Mickelson and how we were in his hotel room in Miami at the CA Championship a couple of years ago when I was writing the book, last year, I guess. And, you know, the conversation started off with him trying to keep me at arm's length. You know, and I had to work hard to get beyond that with him. You know, I mean, I think a lot of today's athletes spend so much time with a microphone in front of their face. I mean, I think about baseball players. I love baseball. I hated covering it. I mean, I just loathed covering it because baseball players, I mean, think about it. You put yourself in their shoes. They go to spring training in February, and they start their season, and there are reporters there every single day who want to talk to them. Then they go through a 162-game season. You know, if they're playing well, they'll go basically in a ballpark or a practice facility pretty much every day from February or March, let's say late February, through October. Now, at some point, that stuff just doesn't become fresh anymore. You know, you just don't want to see those people come in to talk to you every day, and you just don't really have anything to offer. I don't blame them. And I just think that that's why I hated covering baseball, but I love watching it.
Me too. It's interesting because when you go to golfsmarter.com, one of the tabs there says Smarter Podcasts. If you go down, I did a radio syndication. My move out of radio and into sports was I did a radio syndication called Radio Baseball Cards, and it was hosted by Don Drysdale.
One of my dear friends from many years ago.
Yeah, and so I turned it, and I missed Don terribly, as we all do, but I ended up turning that into a podcast because the show was only 90 seconds long, and it was interviews with ball players. And when I would sit down with the baseball players, I'd say to them, okay, before we get started, I just want you to know, I don't care how much money you make, nor do I care what your batting average is.
Right.
And they're like, oh, great, let's talk. And I'd ask, what was the toughest thing you've ever been through? And I even employed a couple of female reporters, knowing that that question would elicit a very different answer to a woman than it would to a guy.
Oh, yeah. Well,
so
I will
check
say
that show out, please.
I'm going to. I'll tell you something else, that a lot of times in my job on television, I have to ask these folks questions that they don't want to hear, because I think that that's what people want to hear. I think back on an interview that I did with Sergio Garcia at the Players' Championship last year on Saturday. I mean, our broadcast, Johnny Miller and Dan Hicks and Roger Maltby spent 4 hours of our broadcasting of our broadcast that Saturday at the Players, talking about how Sergio Garcia struck the ball magnificently, but putted terribly. Just putted terribly. And, I just kind of thought that the thing we needed to talk to him about was his frustration with his putting. And it was a very uncomfortable discussion, and it had been suggested that perhaps I took it a little bit too far, and I don't really revel in talking to people about things that make them uncomfortable. But that's my job sometimes.
Yeah,
because I think that if people are sitting at home and watching the broadcast and they're hearing Johnny Miller, complain for 4 hours about somebody's putting, isn't that what I'm supposed to talk to the guy about?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not the easiest job in the world sometimes, and I'm not the most popular person down there sometimes, but I think that I'd like to think that these folks respect me and understand that this is what it's about. It's that you really need to talk about the things that we need to talk about, and not about the things that are superficial and lame.
I think that you're absolutely right, and I think that they also, you have a microphone in your hand. How could they not expect something like that to come your way?
Yeah, but I think you also have to do it with respect and sensitivity. I try and do that, and I don't always succeed. You bogey a couple holes every now and again. You try and do your best.
Your comment earlier about how Wide Worlds of Sports versus SportsCenter these days, it really did go from the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat, the story behind athletic competition, to fantasy leagues, where it's all about statistics. Now, thank goodness ESPN has a light attitude about it most of the time. They don't take it so seriously. At least they present it that way, but it's all about those statistics.
Yeah, I guess it is. It is what it is. So just try and make your own way and do the best job you can, and you try and never forget that your constituency are the people who are at home and, who are listening and watching. Yeah. And you have to remember that you're trying to serve their best interests. So, and you're not going to be able to please everybody, but as long as you can go home and look at yourself in the mirror.
But you didn't just have professional golfers covered in your book. You went outside of golf in a couple of instances as well.
I talked to Dan Jansen, the Olympic speed skating champion, and former President Bush, 41,
right?
Both of whom are deeply connected to the game of golf. President Bush, 41, his father and grandfather were presidents of the United States Golf Association. And Dan Jansen loves the game to the extent I always tease him. I think I said this in the book. He's the only person I know who's so obsessed with the game, he went out and married his golf professional.
That was very funny.
And actually, his wife, Karen Jansen Palacios, is the LPGA Instructor of the Year for the current year. So, and she's a terrific teacher, And that's one couple that loves the game, those two. So,
but you even made a great comment when you were talking about Dan Jansen in the book. You said an ex-athlete is a tortured soul when it comes to golf.
Yeah, it is. And because the thing is that Dan knows what athletic excellence is. I think, and if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if I'm going to have this verbatim, but he said, he had a complete Yogi Berra line in the book. He said something like, I didn't know how bad I was until I got good. Which is that, it kills him to know, he knows what athletic excellence is. This was a guy who was not only a world champion, he was a dominating world champion. He was Tiger Woods at 500 meters on a speed skating oval. And so for him, he knows what the top of the heap feels like. And he just, when you're not at the top of the heap and you're looking up at it, I think he views his own golf game with a measure of disgust, which is one of his problems, and he readily admits it. He's pretty hard on himself. And but he's a terrific guy. And he's been through a lot. And, I've said it before, I'll say it again, there's no one who is a better example of this book not necessarily being a golf book than Dan. I started out to write a golf book, but I ended up with a book that is really more about how successful people handle adversity. Now, 16 of the 18 people I profile in the book are professional golfers. But, and it's all done through adversity through the prism of golf. But, I talked to Wayne Gretzky, and I talked to Mike Schmidt and Dan Jansen and former President Bush and, lots of other people who are regular folks, or at least they're regular folks when it comes to the game of golf.
Yeah, is it kind of obvious that there's 18 chapters in this? Or is that just, oh my gosh, there's 18 chapters?
Nah, you know what? That's when I first conceived the book, and we were trying to figure out what would be the right number. After the book had been sold to HarperCollins, they requested that it be 18 chapters. Right. That was their idea.
So how did you decide who gets included?
Well, I had a list. I think I started out with I wanted the biggest names. So, I went and got Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus and Greg Norman and Phil Mickelson and Davis Love. And it all really kind of built on each other. The very first person who agreed to do it was Arnold Palmer, who I have a very good relationship with. Wow. And once Arnold did it, and I also have a very good relationship with Jack, I got Arnold and I got Jack. And after that, everybody was pretty much easy because they'd say, well, who else has done it? I'd say, well, Arnold and Jack.
Yeah, of course.
They'd say, oh, okay, well, I guess if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. And I traded on relationships. Again, good relationship with Arnold, with Jack, with Greg Norman. And so it kind of, the part of it was I wanted the big names. And again, because I think everybody's had a slump. And in fact, these guys confirmed it for me that their slumps weren't, slumps like David Duval's, who also, by the way, is in the book. But they were slumps that, of a milder magnitude, but they were every bit as significant to them. So I wanted the biggest names because I think that would have been the type of thing that would have gotten some attention. And then I wanted, I had names of people who I wanted to do because I felt that they were the real slump stories. The slump stories that everybody, that are dramatic. Justin Leonard had a dramatic slump. Scott Verplank had a dramatic slump. Who else? Johnny Miller had a dramatic slump. Who else had?
But it's not like you went in the order of your interviews to do the order. How did you decide the order? Because you kind of, I didn't want to say you buried Palmer and Nicklaus in the middle of the book and end with Hal Sutton. But it
well, you know what? I decided, actually, the ordering of it was all my doing, and I just kind of thought that this made sense. Some of it I had to do in certain orders because certain people mentioned things. Like, for instance, David Duval is the fourth chapter in the book, and I had to do him before I did Greg Norman because Chris Everett, Greg Norman's wife, mentioned something that Duval told me, so it needed to be ordered that way. But, I kind of laid it out in a way that I thought that the folks at HarperCollins wanted Azinger's chapter first because they liked that chapter the most. I just kind of thought, I put Arnold deep in the book because I thought that, he was, the idea was that all these people are equal in terms of what they've been through. And it would have been easy to make it Jack, Arnold, put the two of them first and tried to figure out some kind of pecking order. But one of the things that I was very intent on doing is kind of demonstrating that there is no pecking order. That, I kid with Dottie Pepper all the time because she jokes with me. She looked at the book and she said, hey, she's my colleague at NBC. And she said, hey, what's up with this? I'm chapter 15. I said, what are you complaining about? Arnold Palmer's chapter 14. And Tom Watson's chapter 16. So you're pretty good company back there. The point is I wanted to make it so that the book flowed. And I think that I'm probably biased about this, but I don't think there's a single chapter in this book that is kind of a throwaway chapter. I mean, I think each of these people's stories were fascinating. I mean, Hal Sutton is the last chapter in the book. Hal Sutton told me at one point, he said, when a golf professional is hitting the ball poorly, that basically means they're missing it in one direction. He said at one point in his career, he was so lost that he didn't know where the ball was going, and he was actually afraid for the galleries. That's the last chapter in the book. I mean, there are stories of great champions all throughout this book about how they really, really kind of struggled with adversity and what they had to do to kind of get back on track. And, some of them are dramatic in terms of what they had to do, and others are just kind of, kind of matter of fact. They kind of took hold of their lives. I mean, Justin Leonard was a great story. I mean, at one point, Justin was so lost. He had missed 6 straight cuts, and he had missed the cut at the Honda Classic, and he was so upset. His wife called him after his Friday round. He had missed the cut at Honda a couple of years ago. His wife called him, and she thought he was driving back from the golf course, but he wasn't, because he couldn't drive, because he was sobbing so hysterically that he couldn't drive. He had pulled over into the parking lot of a Whole Foods because he didn't think he could drive when he was this upset. Now, that's not the kind of stuff I get in my post-round interviews on NBC. I think that people really kind of opened up in a certain way, and it was surprising. It wasn't surprising to me. It was encouraging to me. It's the kind of things, I was hearing the kind of things that I was always hoping that I'd hear when I started doing interviewing for a living. But, I deal in, my life is 60 to 75 second snippets after somebody's come off the golf course. These interviews were all an hour or two sitting, at somebody's kitchen table. I mean, I was to Jack's interview I did in his car driving with him, and then I spent an hour in his kitchen, interviewing his wife. So this is people sitting down and I think thinking about things and really not thinking that they have to go somewhere. So
it's gaining trust.
Yeah,
I mean, you spending a lot of time, obviously more than 60 to 75 seconds with somebody, which is a tremendous amount of time for broadcast television.
Yeah.
But being able to sit down with them for hours, or even it felt like in reading it that you had spent days with these people and that they really opened up to you.
Yeah, I think I'd like to think that a bunch of them did.
It feels like it. And that they really opened up to you.
Yeah, I think I'd like to think that a bunch of them did.
It feels like it. And it reads so well in the sense that you can just go straight to a chapter and read it. Because, how can you not have a book about a slump and not include David Duval? It's such a great story. So you can jump right to that, and it's easy reading if you want to keep it in the bathroom type of thing, or you can just barrel right through it, which I did.
Yeah, you know what? One of the things that I think that I think was makes the book very user-friendly is that some people have told me that they read it from the beginning to the end. The one thing and some people just cherry pick and decide, that I want to read about this person or that person. The one thing I would say to anybody who's reading the book is that you should read the first chapter and the last chapter, and then read about anybody you want. Well, actually, don't read the first, the last, then read about anybody. You should read the introduction first, and then read about anybody you want to read about, and then you should also read the last chapter. But it's not it's not a novel. It's not a conventional piece of writing in that you have to read from page 1 to page 250. You can skip around, and it comes in small packages. Most of the chapters are 12 to, I would say, 15 pages. And so it's the type. They're like 20 magazine articles is what they are, and they're all independent of each other. So I think it's very user friendly. I mean, that's just. For me, that was just what worked for me in writing it.
Yeah, well, and it works very well. It really does. I enjoyed it very much. We end our program each week with a quote, and instead of me having to do all this research to find quotes, I let the audience submit their favorite quotes. And it's not just, funny quotes, things like that. What I like to look for are things that keep your head in the game or that help your game. And one of my all-time favorite quotes that I heard from somebody I was playing with, a listener I was playing with, said, "Never follow a bad shot with a stupid shot."
Right.
Which I thought was a great line. And I've keep that in my head when I'm playing too. But there are so many great quotes that I am going to be pulling out of this book, and I will give you credit every time that we're going to close the show with. Like this one that jumped from Hal Sutton, and he said, "Distance is not a big deal. You do not sacrifice accuracy for distance. You get as much distance as you can with accuracy."
Right.
For a golfer, that's really important news.
Oh, yeah. And I think my favorite quote from the book is something that came from Davis Love III's father. Davis Love Jr. himself, of course, was a great golf instructor who learned from Harvey Penick. And Davis Jr. said that sometimes the answer is to try less hard. And you know what? That is so wise.
Yep.
Sometimes you just got to try less hard.
Yep. Absolutely. I love the Penick story that Love told about his dad saying, you've been hitting your 7-iron to the green, now use your 5.
That's right. And I think the way it went was that this is when Davis Jr. was playing at the University of Texas, and Harvey was the coach. And Harvey walked by the tee one day, and he saw Davis hitting to a practice green, which is about 150 yards away. And Harvey said, "Davis, get me some 5-irons on that green up there." And Davis turned around, looked at him, and said, "Coach, that green's 150 yards away. I can hit 7-iron." And Harvey just looked at him and said, "Davis, get me some 5-irons on that green up there." And he walked away. And the point was, slow it down. You don't always have to. You don't always have to do everything you do in a maximum way. Sometimes the answer is to try less hard. Sometimes the answer is to swing not so hard. And that, believe me, if that doesn't apply for life as well as in the game of golf, and I don't know what does.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think for a golfer, that's a really important reminder.
Yeah, I agree. Again, I learned so much about the game from all these people who are obviously so good at it.
And that was going to be my next question, Jimmy. It's like, what is your takeaway? What did you learn? This was a book that was motivated by your own issues. What did you learn from this book?
I learned a lot, but I think that if I had to kind of boil it down to the 2 or 3 things that stick with me the most, I think Arnold Palmer said, you got to slow down. That we do everything we do in life, we just do too fast. We hurry along, and sometimes we swing the club too fast. And he looked at me at one point and said, "What's your hurry?" Now, I'm sure there are a lot of golf professionals out there who are cringing, thinking, the last thing in the world we need is for people to dawdle as they're playing their rounds. I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that, as Maltby, again, quoting Roger Maltby, as Maltby says, your backswing, nobody ever hit the ball with their backswing. It's just foreplay. What's your hurry? Take your time. And I think that that's really something. When I first got into broadcasting, a friend of mine offered me a piece of wisdom that to this day sticks with me as the single most important thing I've heard. He said, no matter how slowly and deliberately you think you're talking, you're not talking anywhere near as slowly and deliberately as you think you're talking. The point is, if you slow down a little bit, you'll probably be more effective at whatever you do. Broadcasting, swinging a golf club. That makes sense to me. So that was a big takeaway for me, which is I got to slow down my swing a little bit. And I think I think most people do swing the club too fast. I think another thing that I take away from this is fundamentals, just in a golf sense. Ben Crenshaw said that there's very little that every golf pro would agree on, but one of the things that every single golf pro would agree on is the importance of a good grip and a good setup and good fundamentals. And so I refocused myself when I started to try and come out of this slump on fundamentals and slowing things down. And so those were 2 things that I think were really, really important to me. And then there's a third thing, which I got from Dan Jansen and a number of other players, but I think about Dan Jansen when I think about this. He said that, he can identify most of his bad shots. And by the way, Dan's, I think, about a two handicap now. But he said, I can identify most of my bad shots by knowing that when I hit a bad shot, that's because I wasn't totally committed to it. Now, what does that mean? We all like to think we're totally committed to it, but lots of times, our mind will wander a little bit. When you're standing over the golf ball, you need to it doesn't mean you need to be tense, but you just need to be all there. You need to really think about what you're doing and not think about, what I'm going to have at the turn or, what my wife said to me that morning. You need to really be totally consumed for those 20 seconds in what you're doing. It doesn't mean you need to be confused and paralyzed by all these, these different swing thoughts, but you just need to be in what you're doing. So slow down, pay attention to fundamentals, and just be committed to what you're doing. And I think that that's a pretty darn good start.
There's got to be people who weren't included in this book that you are ready to do the sequel.
Well, I think that everybody has a story, and we've talked about my wife and I have talked about, what might be another book, because I could not have done this book without her amazing support. But, because I got a family and I have a job, and, every chapter I wrote, she read and, offered her thoughts on it. She's the best editor that I could ever have. But, one of the things that came out of this is, because this really started out to be a golf book and then didn't end up being exclusively about golf, we thought, well, maybe do a book about, about how successful people handle adversity outside of the world of golf. I have talked to plenty of people. I mean, Ian Baker Finch agreed to do a chapter with me, but I think he was reluctant, and I think that he is tired of having his identity be the struggles that he's had and not the successes that he's had. And so it would have been a difficult chapter to write because Ian's a friend and a former colleague when we worked together at ABC and ESPN. And I would have had to have been honest in writing the book, and I don't think that that's something that I think he would have been great and participated with, but I think it might have damaged our friendship, and I wasn't willing to do that.
Good for you. Good for you. Well, the obvious question for me is Michelle Wie.
Well, you know what? I think that that sure could be. I mean, now, by the way, there's two other people that I wanted to include in the book and approached, but they wouldn't, for one reason or another with each of them, they weren't in it. Tiger Woods, I approached him, and his management company said that he could not participate in a book because he's busy. He has a standing contract with another publishing company, and they felt that it would have been a violation of that contract for him to participate in another book. I don't really think that's true.
Yeah, right.
But I thought it was I think it was, the excuse they were using. I don't really think that it doesn't really matter because to have gotten the amount of time that I would have needed from Tiger, I don't know if I could have gotten it. I mean, this would have been sitting down for a long time, really opening up about things, and that's not where Tiger's at right now. And I don't blame him for it. I don't fault him for it. It's just not what he's about right now. I don't really think Tiger's willing to bare his soul like a lot of people in this book did. And the other person is Michael Jordan. I wanted to talk to Michael, and I know Michael. I see him every summer at the golf tournament we do at Edgewood Tahoe, the American Century Celebrity Championship, and Michael agreed to do the book. But then we had some scheduling issues, and he just, Michael's always off doing something, but he would have been a fascinating guy to talk to. Mm-hmm. Again, I think he was intrigued by the idea and had agreed to do it, but I don't really think he was anxious to do it because I don't think that he wanted, and Michael Jordan doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who he's like Tiger. He doesn't really want to talk about his failures. And it would have been interesting to talk to him about it, but I don't know. So those are the two guys I would have liked to have had in the book, but couldn't do.
Well, the book's called Breaking the Slump, How Great Players Survive Their Darkest Moments in Golf and What You Can Learn From Them. And it is written by NBC journalist. I don't want to call you a reporter. You are a journalist, but you're on television for NBC, Jimmy Roberts.
Brett, thanks for having me. This was interesting. It was good to talk to you. I enjoyed our conversation.